Hi again, welcome back to the Scandinavian History Podcast with me, Michael Schenkman. Last time, Karl XII returned home to Sweden, tried to conquer Norway, and was shot in the head on a dark November night in 1718. As soon as King Karl died, two things happened. The invasion of Norway was cut short, and the race for the throne started. Karl's sister, Ulrika Eleonora, managed to outmaneuver her nephew, Karl Frederik, and won, but the prize was heavy. She had to give up her right to the crown and instead suffer the humiliation of being elected queen. She also had to accept that she would not be an absolute monarch. Instead, the Riksdag and the Council reclaimed their traditional powers, lost to the crown back in the 1680s. As a final insult, Ulrika Eleonora didn't get to remain monarch for more than a couple of years. Instead, her husband, Frederik, took over as King Frederik I in 1720. Today, we'll leave the Swedes to pick up the pieces of their collapsed empire and instead turn our attention to another King Frederik, namely Frederik IV of Denmark. He, who was the cousin of both Karl XII and Ulrika Eleonora, not only belonged to the winning side of the Great Northern War, he also still retained absolute power in his kingdom. Episode 106, Piety and Power. Even though he was born to inherit absolute power over Denmark and Norway, young Crown Prince Frederik didn't receive any formal education. I'm no expert in systems of government, but it seems like a bit of an oversight. Perhaps surprisingly though, as king, Frederik IV was both dutiful and diligent. Maybe even a little too dutiful. He didn't really like to delegate and tried to make all the important decisions personally. Perhaps Frederik IV acted this way because he didn't fully trust his bureaucracy and the noblemen who populated it. This was one of the precious few lessons his father Christian V had passed on to young Frederik. Don't trust the old nobility and don't give them positions of power or influence. As king, Frederik showed that he had taken this lesson to heart, and he was quick to dismiss members of the old aristocracy from the royal administration or the military. Instead, he promoted men born commoners or belonging to the new nobility, ennobled under the system of absolutism, men who knew they owned their positions to the crown. Frederik IV also introduced a system where anyone had the right to seek an audience with the king to make a complaint or a suggestion. This was a way to get an alternative source of information, not filtered through the administration. He often traveled through the kingdom, inspecting troops or towns. On these trips, he was seen by lots and lots of his subjects. This availability had the positive side effect of boosting the king's popularity among regular Danes. And even though popular support isn't as useful in an absolute monarchy as it is in, say, a democracy where you have to win elections, it's definitely better to be popular than unpopular. History is full of examples showing how widespread unpopularity can undermine a throne. During the Great Northern War, Frederik IV frequently traveled with the army, even though he wasn't much of a military strategist himself, and he wouldn't have dreamt of leading battles from the front line like his cousin Karl XII of Sweden. Still, the mere presence of the king boosted morale among the Danish troops, but, as we've seen in previous episodes, it didn't suffice to retake the lost provinces east of the Øresund Strait. When the Great Northern War finally ended in 1721, Frederik IV took advantage of Sweden's relative weakness to strengthen his hold of his German duchies, Schleswig and Holstein. He issued an edict stating that the people of Schleswig would no longer swear allegiance to the House of Gottorp, but rather to the Danish crown. Binding Schleswig-Holstein closer to the crown was both a way to consolidate King Frederik's realm and a punishment of the Holstein-Gottorp family, which had sided with Sweden during the Great Northern War. Denmark no longer had a Swedish ally threatening its back. The Holstein pretender, Karl Frederik, who had lost the race for the Swedish crown against his aunt Ulrika Eleonora, had, perhaps ironically, escaped to Russia of all places. There, he married Tsar Peter's daughter Anna, in 1725. All of this meant that Schleswig-Holstein would be de facto integrated into the Kingdom of Denmark, at least politically, because culturally, the duchies were as German as ever. But in this pre-nationalist era, that was less of a problem than it would prove to be later on. For King Frederik, it certainly wasn't an issue. You could even argue that culturally, he himself was more German than Danish. His mother had been a German princess, and so was his wife. The king's primary language was German, not Danish, even though he apparently had a poor grasp of any language, at least in terms of reading and writing. Later generations of Danes have sometimes held this against him, but his contemporaries didn't. They didn't find it weird at all. In fact, about 20% of the population of Copenhagen was German-speaking during the reign of Frederik IV. His contemporaries had more of an issue with the king's love life. As crown prince, he married a North German princess called Louise. It was a political marriage, like was so often the case in those days. As an aside, I'd like to point out that it was common to marry for other reasons than love, not only in royal or aristocratic circles. It was the norm almost everywhere. If the young couple loved each other, that was, of course, considered a plus, but it was in no way a requirement. People married for financial reasons, for protection, for connections. Only fools would marry for something as ephemeral as love. So, in that regard, Frederik was conforming to the expectations, and everyone approved of his union with Louise. So far so good. But, in addition to his wife, Frederik also had several mistresses. In fact, he ended up having no fewer than 13 children with 4 different women. Again, this wasn't exactly unheard of, especially in royal circles, and most people would have been perfectly happy to look the other way and ignore a royal affair here and there, as long as it would have been conducted discreetly. But Frederik wasn't conducting his extramarital affairs discreetly. Far from it. He went as far as to marry 2 of his mistresses, even though he already was married to Queen Louise. This made the king a bigamist, and bigamy was punished by death according to Danish law. But luckily for Frederik, the absolute monarch was above the law and couldn't be prosecuted. Meanwhile, the Danish church bent over backwards trying to justify the king's actions by referring to the biblical kings of Israel having several wives. The first time this happened was in 1703, when the king fell in love with a noblewoman called Elizabeth, who happened to be the daughter of the Prussian ambassador to Copenhagen. It was scandalous, obviously, but the Prussians made sure the relationship was known as a proper marriage, hoping it would be good for Danish-Prussian relations. This second marriage didn't last long, though, because the unfortunate bride died giving birth to a son already in 1704. The distraught king gave her a lavish public funeral, and then took her lady-in-waiting as his next mistress. A few years passed, when King Frederik was happy not marrying his mistresses, but then, in 1711, during a visit to Jutland, where he attended a masked ball at the home of his Grand Chancellor, the king laid eyes on his host's 19-year-old daughter, the Countess Anne-Sophie Reventlow. He fell head over heels in love with her, and more or less stole her away from her childhood home, bringing her to Copenhagen, where he married her. Even though her mother wasn't too pleased that the teenage daughter married the 40-year-old king, the rest of the family made sure to milk the opportunity for all it was worth. Anne-Sophie's marriage to the king, however dodgy it may have been, was a superb springboard to jobs, titles, money, and land for her relatives. Anne-Sophie herself was given apartments in the royal palace in Copenhagen, and she soon became the center of the social life of the leading circles in the capital. All to the chagrin of the legal and increasingly annoyed Queen. Poor Queen Louise struggled to cope with the situation. She felt humiliated by King Frederik's constant and very public relationships with other women, and largely withdrew from public life, spending her days at a country estate to get away from her husband and his affairs. She was a strictly religious woman, and maybe it was her piety, or perhaps her pride, that made it impossible for her to do what other queens usually did when their husbands took a mistress or 2. In most cases, queens and other women of this era chose to turn a blind eye, but not Queen Louise. She found herself incapable of just ignoring the fact that her husband hadn't merely taken a mistress, but actually married her. The fact that people weren't outraged and even went along with it only increased her frustration. Louise became bitter and even more demonstratively pious than she'd been before, which actually, and quite cruelly, only increased people's sympathy for her already popular husband. Louise didn't even manage to channel her religiosity into charity work like other grand ladies. This too was held against her. Only her son, the Crown Prince Christian, was 100% on her side. He would extol his mother's memory and honor in years to come. Queen Louise died in 1721, and King Frederik saw this as an excellent opportunity to upgrade Anne-Sophie. He went ahead and married her again, this time as his lawful wife and queen, which in itself probably would have been welcomed in circles that were irked by the king's bigamy. In fact, most people who had an opinion on the matter had probably expected him to marry her, now that he was free to do so. The problem was the timing. Frederik was so eager to make an honest woman out of Anne-Sophie that he went ahead and married her the very day after the funeral of Queen Louise. To make matters even worse from a public relations perspective, 2 months later, Anne-Sophie was also crowned Queen of Denmark. This was all too much. Making Anne-Sophie queen, and so soon after Louise's death, was seen to be tactless and in very poor taste, even for Frederik IV. One person who was particularly upset was Crown Prince Christian. He was not a big fan of his new stepmom, and when the time came for the coronation of his own wife, Christian had a completely new crown made for the occasion. He didn't want to sully his own wife with a crown that had touched the head of Anne-Sophie. But as shocking as the coronation of Anne-Sophie had been, it was nothing compared to the catastrophe that was to hit the Danish capital a few years later. It was in the fall of 1728, in the evening of October 20th to be precise, in a house located close to the western city gate. Among the tenants of this house were the restaurant manager Peter Rasmussen and his wife Anne Iversdatter. This evening, they were casting candles in their apartment when something went wrong. Very wrong. A fire started in their home. Afterward, Peter and Anne claimed that it happened because their 7-year-old son had been playing with a candle, but it's just as likely that their own carelessness caused the fire, and they just blamed their son to escape punishment. No matter how the fire started, it soon spread throughout the building, and then to the neighboring houses. In this part of Copenhagen, the medieval buildings stood tightly packed, and the wind carried the flames eastward, straight towards the center of the city. Despite the fact that the watchmen quickly spotted the danger and sounded the alarm, the fire department couldn't do much, partly because their equipment was primitive and partly because it was tricky to move about in the narrow lanes of this part of Copenhagen. So the fire raged on and spread virtually unchecked throughout the night. The following morning, the authorities made an attempt to stop the fire. If they couldn't save the buildings that were already ablaze, at least they could try to make sure the fire wouldn't spread any further. They brought cannons to the square Gammeltorv and started to fire at burning buildings, hoping that they'd collapse. When that didn't work, they decided to try and blow up some houses to create a gap that the fire hopefully wouldn't be able to jump across, thereby limiting the damage. Men were sent into the buildings slated for destruction, carrying kegs of gunpowder. This gunpowder would then be ignited, blowing the buildings up. A great plan, at least on paper. Unfortunately, some of the gunpowder caught fire and exploded prematurely, killing the men who were working on preparing the house for demolition. Even though the building did collapse, the men inside were killed, and the explosion actually ignited other buildings nearby, spreading the fire instead of stopping it. One of these buildings that caught fire from the explosion was the Vorfrukirke, or the Church of Our Lady. It burned quickly, and by 9:30 in the morning, the spire collapsed. It didn't take long for the whole church to be destroyed by flames. This was particularly unfortunate because many Copenhageners had brought their property there, hoping they'd be safe from fire in the church, protected either by its stone walls or through divine intervention. But no such luck. Later that day, the fire reached Copenhagen University. The library, containing the largest collection of books in Scandinavia at the time, 35,000 highly flammable texts, as well as a large assortment of historical documents, was housed in the attic of the Trinity Church. The fire reached the church around 5 o'clock in the afternoon, and 5 hours later, at about 10 in the evening, the ceiling collapsed, feeding the library to the flames below. The Icelandic scholar and manuscript collector Árni Magnússon, who had gone to great lengths collecting priceless medieval manuscripts of Icelandic sagas, lost all his books and records in the fire. But luckily, he did manage to save several of the irreplaceable handwritten manuscripts he'd brought from Iceland. The famous round tower attached to the Trinity Church escaped largely intact, but the observatory on the top floor was completely gutted by the blaze. That meant that the astronomical instruments and records that had belonged to the Danish 16th century astronomer Tycho Brahe were all lost. Tycho Brahe was known for his comprehensive and exact observations of the stars and the planets. He was the one who discovered both supernovas and that comets travel through outer space and not the Earth's atmosphere. That was especially impressive since he did all his work before the invention of the telescope. Despite all his achievements, Tycho Brahe had been forced into exile by his enemies at court and spent the last years of his life in Prague. There, he once attended a banquet hosted by the Count of Rosenberg. The aging Danish astronomer really needed to go to the bathroom, but didn't get up from the table since that would have been a breach of etiquette. Instead, he tried to hold it in. In the end, his bladder actually burst, and after 11 days of agony, he died in October 1601. Tycho Brahe did not deserve that fate. And speaking of people who didn't deserve their fate, back to the burning Danish capital in 1728. At the same time as the university library in the Trinity Church became engulfed in the flames, the fire also reached yet another church, this time the Church of the Holy Spirit, only a few hundred meters to the south. At 8 o'clock in the evening, its carillons started to play. The bells chimed a hymn called "Turn Your Anger, Lord, by Mercy." But clearly God wasn't listening, or wasn't in the mood, because shortly afterwards, the bell tower collapsed into the burning church below. The fire raged on, unchecked, until Saturday, October 23rd. By then, the wind had died down, and the firefighters had been able to demolish enough buildings to create a fire break that was wide enough to stop the flames from spreading any further. In the end, some 1,600 buildings burned to the ground, including 5 churches. That represented almost a third of Copenhagen and roughly half of the medieval part of the city. According to estimates, approximately 20% of the population lost their homes in the fire. That's about 15,000 out of 70,000 who lived in the Danish capital at the time. Luckily, and despite the vast material destruction, relatively few people died. Most people managed to escape before the flame engulfed their homes. Among the few who did perish were patients at a hospital who weren't evacuated on time. There were those who saw the Great Fire of 1728 as divine punishment for the king's sinfulness, especially his inability to stay monogamous. One of those who feared that this could be the case was King Frederik himself. The fire, in combination with the fact that all 6 of his and Anne Sophie's children died in infancy, as well as of various health issues including a heart condition, made the King of Denmark reconsider some of his life choices. And in his old age, he turned to religion. King Frederik IV became increasingly interested in pietism, a relatively new movement that emphasized individual piety and leading a life full of good deeds and charity. The king supported missionary works, but he didn't only care about the immortal souls of his subjects. He also wanted to improve conditions for them here on earth. He established a rudimentary social safety net and schools for poor children on crown lands. He even went as far as to abolish the serfdom in Denmark. That's obviously a laudable pursuit, but there were other, less popular side effects to the king's newfound interest in religion. During his last years, the court in Copenhagen became increasingly pious and formal. And Frederik also passed a number of laws aiming to increase the Christian character of public life. For instance, he banned working on Sundays and holidays, instating fees for those who didn't go to church, and forbade theaters, masquerades, and other forms of entertainment on Sundays and holidays. Frederik IV died in October 1730. Before he drew his last breath, he made his son, Crown Prince Christian, promise to treat Queen Anne Sophie well. He wanted her to get the same treatment that all dowager queens received, but under the circumstances, he feared that she wouldn't. Crown Princess Christian promised to do as his father wanted. He even signed a document to that effect. But already a few weeks after his father's death, Christian, now upgraded to King Christian VI, banished Anne-Sophie from court. He sent her back to the Jutland estate where she'd grown up. The new king also confiscated most of her fortune. Anne-Sophie spent the rest of her life in the rural periphery, far away from court, living on a modest pension that her stepson the king provided. When she died, she was actually buried in Roskilde Cathedral, the church where the kings and queens of Denmark are traditionally buried. But she wasn't given a final resting place next to her husband, Frederik IV. Instead, she was discreetly stashed away in a side chapel, and nowhere on her tomb does it say to whom she was married. Back when he was alive, Frederik IV had allowed his eldest son, Crown Princess Christian, to choose his own wife. Maybe Frederik had learned that marrying for political reasons wasn't the best recipe for familial bliss, and there was something to be said for chemistry between a bride and a groom. The woman Christian chose was called Sophie Magdalene. She was a German princess, but unfortunately from a poor and unimportant family, so she was considered a bad choice from a political point of view. In addition, Sophie Magdalene was shy, pious, and awkward in social situations. But so was Christian, so they were well suited for each other, and their marriage turned out to be quite harmonious. Christian VI not only shared his wife's religiosity and awkwardness when interacting with other people, he was also weak, nervous, and uncomfortable in his very public role. Since he wasn't particularly adept at picking up social cues, he relied heavily on formal court etiquette and strict rules for how he, as sovereign, could and should be approached. In addition, he apparently had a whiny voice. Oh, and he was also a hypochondriac. In other words, he was the opposite of his father, who had been an outgoing and dynamic, charming young man. You may argue that the personalities of the king and queen aren't more than gossip, but that's not entirely true. In a situation where all the political power in the state lies in the hands of one man, the personality of that man matters. Remember how Frederik IV was popular because he was considered available and interested in the well-being of his people. When Christian VI and Sophie Magdalene isolated themselves not only from the common people but even from the court, this had political implications. It was so bad that when the royal couple traveled through Copenhagen in their carriage, they would draw the curtains so that no one would be able to see them. They did this because they were shy and uncomfortable being observed all the time. But the people, and many courtiers, interpreted it as haughtiness, arrogance, and a lack of interest in their subjects. As if the Danish aristocrats and courtiers didn't have enough reason to dislike Christian VI already, he also followed his father's, or rather his grandfather's, advice and distrusted the nobility. But King Christian took it one step further and fired anyone who was too independent-minded and opposed his views. Not being pious enough was also held against some top bureaucrats. Instead, Christian VI surrounded himself with deeply religious yes-men, many of them relatives of his wives, poor German noblemen who received high offices in Denmark. Much like his parents, Christian VI was deeply religious, and he continued his father's efforts to make the Danes more religious as well. The ban on Sunday entertainment remained, and so did the requirement to attend church. But fines weren't enough of a punishment for King Christian. From now on, the priest would publicly shame you from the pulpit if you didn't show up to church, and serial offenders were put in the pillory. The king even ordered that the gates of Copenhagen would be locked during religious services to make sure no one was tempted to escape out into nature instead of going to church. He also established the College of General Church Inspection and introduced the ceremony of confirmation in 1736, making sure that every Dane would have a sufficient knowledge of Christian teachings. The correct Danish Lutheran Christian teaching, that is. Those who strayed and developed other Christian ideas at odds with the official Danish orthodoxy were to be corrected by the local priest. If they persisted in their error, they'd be punished. All for the good of their immortal souls, obviously. It shouldn't come as much of a surprise that Copenhagen in the 1730s became a boring place, characterized by displays of the strictest public piety. The author and playwright Ludvig Holberg described the inhabitants of the capital as venerable and solemn like old cats. In case you didn't pick up on the subtle sarcasm, Holberg was not a fan. He'd been born in 1684 to an upper-middle-class family in Bergen, Norway. He was a man of the world, and he had traveled extensively in Europe, visiting England, France, and the Netherlands as a young man. But eventually he settled in Copenhagen, where he became a professor at the university, first in metaphysics and later in rhetoric. Holberg was a prolific writer, and he wrote books on history and politics, describing and analyzing various European countries. The point of these books was to improve the Danish administration through knowledge. Holberg thought, and it seems like a reasonable position to take, that bureaucrats who are well informed are more likely to make better decisions. In his histories, he stressed the importance of the middle classes and the economy, as opposed to earlier works that focused on the aristocracy and the glory they achieved on the battlefield. But it's not for his analysis of the British parliamentary system that Holberg is remembered today. He was also an author and playwright, and became famous in that role in the 1720s, writing comedies for the stage in Copenhagen. His plays were mostly satires, poking fun at society and politics, and they were enormously successful. But already by the end of that decade, when Frederik IV discovered religion and developed his distaste for the theatre, Holberg had to return to writing about history and politics. Nonetheless, his plays survived, and once the lid of religiosity was lifted, they were once again performed. In fact, some of them still are to this day. Ludvig Holberg represented something new on the Scandinavian cultural scene, a product of the Age of Enlightenment and of capitalism. He was a writer who didn't write primarily for princes or the church. Instead, he wrote for the bourgeoisie. It was this growing class of literate people with disposable income who bought his books and went to see his plays, because they wanted to be informed and entertained. In the 1740s, toward the end of his life, Holberg turned his attention to ethics. Some of his musings on that topic skirted dangerously close to criticism of religion in the form that was sanctioned by the Danish church. But even though his writings were closely scrutinized by his critics, he managed to keep out of legal trouble. Holberg also gave the Danish language a boost. Before Holberg, the German language had a great influence over the way many Danes spoke and wrote, but he replaced many German technical terms and other words with Danish equivalents. His students and admirers later turned this into a political program, campaigning for the king to favor Danes over foreigners, in practice Germans. But the cosmopolitan Holberg didn't like to go that far. Instead, he always argued for merit over origins, perhaps because to him the more important conflict was between the aristocracy and the middle classes, not Danes versus Germans. Anyway, in addition to being boring and stifled by strict religiosity, Denmark also experienced an economic downturn during the reign of Christian VI. The problem stemmed from a crisis in the agrarian sector, made worse by bad harvests and an increase of migration of people from the countryside to cities and towns following the abolition of the serfdom under Frederik IV. Christian VI responded by supporting the large landowners, since their estates were the backbone of the Danish economy. They were given tax exemptions and a monopoly on selling grain to Norway. The king even went as far as to soften the ban against work on Sundays, allowing the peasants to harvest the fields if the weather was about to worsen and time was of the essence. To make sure that the large estates wouldn't suffer from any shortage of labor, King Christian also reintroduced a form of serfdom in Denmark. From now on, Danish men between 14 and 36 years old weren't allowed to move without the expressed consent of the landowner on whose land they lived. Landowners were also allowed to trade workers with each other without the workers' consent, and could even hand them over to the army or navy for military service. Later, when Danish peasants started to send their sons off to learn a trade in the cities before they turned 14 in order to save them from a life of toil on some nobleman's estate, the age of serfdom was extended from 4 to 40 years old. The king also helped the economy by initiating a number of large-scale construction projects. But I'm not entirely convinced that he did this to boost the economy. It's more likely he did it to boost his own image and prestige, because the construction projects weren't roads, ports, hospitals, schools, or marketplaces, but rather a couple of new royal palaces. For instance, he had the old medieval castle in Copenhagen torn down and replaced with a new, modern palace called Christiansborg. Even though it created jobs and helped put food on the table for hundreds of families for 10 years, it was an expensive project. It cost 27 barrels of gold to build, and when it was completed, the king ordered that it be surrounded by heavy iron chains to keep the unwashed masses out. Even though most people probably hadn't expected an invitation, that was still offensive on a symbolic level. It did nothing to improve King Christian's popularity among his subjects. The king may have spent a lot on palaces, but he did save a ton of money in another way. He didn't start any wars, even though he was tempted to attack Sweden in the mid-1740s, but that'll be the topic for a later episode. In fact, Denmark enjoyed peace throughout the whole reign of Christian VI, making him the first king of Danish history not to be involved in any wars at all. And apparently he wanted it that way. He genuinely disliked war and actively pursued a policy of peace. Christian concluded treaties with Russia, Austria, Britain, and even Sweden. And he went as far as to tear down the gloating victory monument that had been erected where Karl XII had been shot dead at Fredriksten Fortress in 1718. Christian VI eventually died in August 1746, missed by precious few people, possibly only by his wife. Next time, we'll continue to look at the Danish economy, but from a global perspective, because we'll talk about Scandinavian colonies around the world. For almost 100 years, both Denmark and Sweden had been participating in the European colonization of other continents. It's about time that we check in to see how they were doing. I hope you enjoyed this episode of the Scandinavian History Podcast. If you did, why not spread the word among your friends? Also, please consider leaving a stellar review, or at least 5 stars, on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. This is an excellent way to attract new listeners and to support the show. If you crave more content related to Scandinavian history, I recommend you look up the show on social media. For instance, you can go to facebook.com/Scandinavian History Podcast. Via the Facebook page, you can also send me questions or angry messages about things I've said or not said on the show. If you prefer the social media platform formerly known as Twitter, you can follow me and send me messages at Schenkman. That's SHAINKMAN. I look forward to hearing from you.